Dispatch logs from a remote lake revealed a final message. The county dispatch center rarely handled anything more serious than stranded boaters or late night noise complaints from campsites. The remote lake sat miles from the nearest town, and even in peak season, the radios stayed mostly silent. That routine made the strange transmission on a cold November night stand out instantly to the lone dispatcher, Claire Henley, who had worked the overnight shift for 9 years without hearing anything like it. At 1:40 in the morning, the console crackled sharply and delivered a clipped voice that sounded strained and breathless. Claire straightened in her chair because the call did not match any recognized unit code or civilian hailing pattern. The voice only said anyone on Channel 2 respond before the transmission cut abruptly into static. She waited for a follow-up but heard nothing except faint wind against the microphone. Claire scanned through the logs and saw no active patrols near the lake. She called out to the nearest ranger unit, asking if they switched channels without notifying dispatch. The ranger replied from 20 miles away and denied making the transmission. Claire hesitated before sending a general call to all frequencies, requesting any nearby unit to confirm radio status. Every response came from locations far outside the lake region. After 10 minutes of silence, Claire marked the event as an unverified transmission, but something about the voice left her uneasy. It had a rough urgency that did not sound like a prank or accidental broadcast. She kept Channel 2 open and adjusted the gain slightly. A low hum pulsed through the line, repeating every few seconds like the microphone pressed against a vibrating surface. At 2:11, the voice returned suddenly with a short burst of words. Claire increased volume cautiously and heard someone whisper, "Switch the light." Then something in the background distorted the rest. She replayed the clip but could not isolate the final syllables. She logged the incident and contacted a supervisor who instructed her to notify the Lake Ranger station even though it was closed for the season. When she reached the station's voicemail, she left a message but continued monitoring the channel. The hum grew louder, as if the caller moved closer to the microphone or adjusted equipment. The console recorded a brief metallic scraping sound followed by a heavy exhale. Claire leaned forward and felt a chill run along her neck because the exhale carried a faint tremble like the speaker fought to remain calm. Another transmission came through, and this time the voice sounded clearer even though it remained tense. It said lights went out and something moved in the water, then drifted into static. Claire wrote the words exactly as she heard them and checked for known vessels on the lake even though most docks were empty. The last registered boat to operate in that region was logged 2 weeks prior. Claire asked dispatch to patch her into the emergency interagency line. She explained the situation to a state officer who agreed to send a ground unit toward the lake, even though the road conditions looked poor. While waiting, Claire monitored the channel continually and listened for any movement. At 2:37, she heard the voice again with a longer message interrupted by low interference. The speaker said, "Anyone hearing this, we are not alone on the lake," and then either fell silent or lost signal. Claire replayed the recording and noticed a faint second sound layered behind the voice. It resembled a slow, rhythmic sloshing, like something large moved through shallow water near the microphone. She marked the sound as unidentified and added it to the ongoing log. She kept her eyes fixed on the console while the hum returned stronger than before. The vibrations almost matched a heartbeat pattern and seemed to sync with the shifts in static. Claire switched headphones to isolate the frequency and realized the hum came from a transmitter that moved constantly, like someone holding equipment while walking across an unstable surface. At 2:50, the voice returned in a rushed whisper. It said, "Lights below us. I see them moving," then stopped mid-sentence. Claire listened closely and heard faint tapping, like something knocking against metal. She recorded the tap pattern in the log and noted the uneven rhythm. It did not resemble boat hull impacts or drifting debris because the taps repeated in an intentional sequence. The state officer radioed that he reached the turnoff toward the lake but needed several more minutes to reach the main trail. Claire relayed the most recent transmission and urged him to maintain radio contact. She felt the tension rising as the channel hummed again and the static thickened like heavy wind pushing against the microphone. At 3:02, the final message came through. It arrived in a smooth tone, unlike the earlier frantic bursts. The voice said, "If anyone finds this, tell them we stayed above the water as long as we could." Then a loud splash echoed before the line went dead. Claire removed her headset slowly, stunned by the abrupt clarity of the final words. She attempted multiple hail calls but received no response. The hum disappeared, replaced by cold silence. Moments later, the state officer radioed that he reached the lake but saw no boats or lights. The shoreline looked undisturbed and the water remained perfectly calm under the moonlight. He scanned the area with his flashlight and reported no signs of recent activity. Claire asked him to check the eastern dock because the final message suggested movement near water. He walked the path and reached the dock, where he found an old fishing shack partially open. Inside, he discovered a portable transmitter set to channel 2 with its battery nearly drained. The microphone rested near a narrow window overlooking the lake. The officer inspected the shack thoroughly but found no footprints or equipment besides the transmitter. The dust on the floor looked undisturbed except for a path leading toward the water's edge. That path ended abruptly at damp boards where drops of lake water glistened under the flashlight. No boat tied to the dock, no gear left behind, no indication that anyone recently occupied the area. He radioed Claire and explained that the transmitter appeared older than expected and might have been left behind long before the season ended. Claire felt confusion settle in because the voice she heard did not sound distorted by old equipment. It sounded immediate and close, like someone broadcasted only minutes before the officer arrived. When morning broke, a search team scanned the lake but found nothing unusual. They discovered no overturned boats and no missing person reports matched the timeline. The shack contained no personal items, and the transmitter carried no fingerprints except Claire's and the officer's. Officials ruled the transmissions untraceable and classified them as incomplete radio interference. Claire reviewed the recordings repeatedly during the following week. Each time she listened, she noticed small sounds she missed earlier. The splashing near the final message carried a deep resonance, like something heavy surfaced before submerging again. The tapping sequence behind the mid-call whisper repeated in a pattern she could not translate. And the cold tone of the last message felt far too composed for someone in distress. The event faded from official attention after a month, but Claire never forgot the voice. She often replayed the first transmission and noted that the caller said anyone on Channel 2 respond, which meant they believed someone could hear them. She wondered whether the person broadcasted from the shack or somewhere else entirely. The lack of physical evidence made each possibility unsettling. Today, the dispatch console sits quiet during most night shifts, yet Claire keeps Channel 2 open by habit. Sometimes she swears she hears a faint hum rising through the silence. It comes in short pulses and then dissolves quickly before she can record it. She cannot decide whether it's interference or something reaching toward the surface again. And every time the lake report crosses her inbox, she remembers the final line that never leaves her thoughts. No clue in the cabin fire until a hidden room was uncovered. Investigators believed the cabin fire would be simple to explain because the burn pattern looked consistent with an accidental ignition. Crews arrived before sunrise and saw nothing unusual except the fast collapse of the living room floor, which suggested heat rising through older boards. They found no immediate evidence of foul play, which left the report leaning toward a basic equipment failure. Ronan Vale was 36 and worked as a county investigator who reviewed isolated structure fires across rural properties. He arrived at the burn site just after the flames died and studied the layout with a practiced calm. His simple goal for the morning was to confirm the reported ignition point and complete a routine diagram before moving to his next scheduled inspection. The small clearing felt quiet, except for light wind pushing smoke across the ashes. He walked a slow circle around the cabin remains and noticed an odd rectangular collapse near the center of the floor. The collapse looked too clean for natural failure because the edges held straight lines instead of jagged breaks. Ronan crouched to check the soil below the debris and felt lingering warmth rising from the opening, which made him question the initial assessment. He used a long probe to shift charred boards aside until the probe hit a metal latch hidden directly under the collapsed floor. The latch sat on a reinforced panel coated with soot and residue from the fire above. Ronan stepped back and signaled firefighters to widen the opening because he suspected a concealed room sat beneath the living space. His partner arrived with cutting tools and cleared the boards until the hidden panel became fully visible. They opened the panel carefully and revealed a small cellar that did not appear in any county map. Ronan descended the short ladder and stood inside a windowless room that smelled of stale air and smoke drifting from above. The room held a single chair facing a table covered in dust thick enough to obscure faint markings. He noticed lengths of rope on the floor which looked frayed in multiple spots as if someone struggled against them long ago. He examined the wall nearest the ladder and saw dozens of scratch marks arranged in uneven vertical lines. The marks grew deeper toward the door, which suggested a person attempted to claw through the wooden frame while trapped inside. Ronan called out to his partner above and requested photographs of every surface because the cellar felt older than the rest of the cabin. His partner lowered a camera and began recording each detail from the entrance. They found no body in the cellar, which increased Ronan's unease because the rope fragments implied long-term confinement. As they searched further, they discovered a damaged locker pressed against the far wall and opened it cautiously. Inside the locker, they found a faded jacket, a cracked cup, and a journal held together by brittle binding. Ronan opened the journal slowly and read scattered lines written in shaky script. One entry said, "Heard him walking again tonight," while another read, "Stayed silent until footsteps faded." The final readable note said he reached the stairs, which confused Ronan because the cellar contained no ascending steps other than the ladder. He photographed the entries and sealed the journal because he believed it belonged to someone imprisoned inside the concealed room. When he returned to the surface, Ronan asked dispatch to check missing persons records from earlier decades since the cellar looked abandoned for a long time. A match appeared for a woodworker named Jared Mallon, who disappeared in 1993 after leaving his home for an extended project. The original investigation concluded without strong leads, which meant the case remained inactive for years. Ronan compared the journal handwriting with samples from the old file and found enough similarity to cause concern. He believed Mallon might have been held in the cellar before the property changed hands. The rope fragments and scratch marks supported that theory, but the absence of skeletal remains left a troubling gap. Ronan studied the burn pattern again and realized the fire originated directly above the concealed room, which suggested deliberate intent. They examined the surface debris more closely and found the body of a man identified as Glenn Harker, who rented the cabin recently. The medical examiner later confirmed that Harker died before the fire spread because his lungs held no smoke. Ronan inspected the remaining boards near the door and found a fresh indentation on the frame that looked like a recent impact. The indentation faced inward, which suggested a physical struggle inside the cabin. While clearing the outer foundation, Ronan noticed a metal hinge buried beneath a thick layer of ash near the rear corner. The hinge did not match the cellar entrance and appeared newer than other structural elements. Firefighters dug along the foundation until another concealed compartment became visible beneath a warped plank. The compartment held a wooden box secured by a newer chain that showed almost no corrosion. Ronan removed the chain and opened the box, expecting to find stored tools or supplies. Instead, he found skeletal remains curled tightly with wrists bound by aged twine. The skull contained a deep fracture which indicated a strong blunt strike. The remains looked older than recent cabin activity, which made Ronan suspect the box was hidden years before Harker rented the property. He photographed the bones and sealed the compartment again. He followed tracks behind the cabin and noticed a single set of footprints leading toward the dense tree line. The prints cut sharply into the soil, which indicated someone carried heavy weight or moved quickly while leaving the property. The tracks ended about 30 feet from the clearing, where the soil shifted suddenly from damp to loose. Ronan suspected the person continued toward a forest path, but no clear trail appeared beyond that point. He returned to the cabin and reviewed the journal entries again while standing near the open cellar. The repeated mention of footsteps and references to something moving on stairs suggested the captive believed someone else lived above the room. Ronan asked his partner to inspect the far wall of the cellar again, and they discovered a faint outline shaped like an older doorway. They removed surface boards and revealed a narrow chute descending into compacted earth. The chute displayed grooves from repeated scraping, possibly created by hands or feet pushing against the walls. Ronan believed the captive attempted to escape through the chute, which collapsed at some point under the weight of surrounding soil. He measured the depth and noted that the chute ended in a compressed area large enough for a person to lie curled. The soil remained undisturbed recently, which meant the chute had not been used during the fire. As investigators completed their survey, Ronan walked the perimeter again and spotted new indentations near the tree line. They looked like drag marks, although they did not match animal patterns or tire shapes. The marks led toward the same area where the footprints ended earlier, which made Ronan uneasy. He believed the person who hid the wooden box might have returned shortly before the fire began. County officials ordered the property sealed until structural experts evaluated the concealed rooms. Ronan wrote a detailed summary stating that the cabin fire exposed an older history of confinement and hidden movement beneath the building. He concluded that Harker's death likely connected to someone protecting the secret of the cellar and the second compartment. The case remained open because too many details lacked clear explanation. Today, the cabin site sits behind temporary fencing while investigators review old reports for connections. Hikers who pass the clearing sometimes mention hearing muffled thuds near the burned foundation when wind settles across the ash. Ronan avoids speculation, but believes the cellar holds more history than county records reveal. Each time he reviews the journal lines, he imagines someone pacing above the hidden room and remembers that no clue surfaced until the opening finally revealed its secret. The truck stop camera caught something walking behind the driver. The graveyard shift cameras at the interstate truck stop were supposed to record nothing more interesting than tired drivers stretching their legs. Most nights, the screens in the security booth cycled through empty fuel lanes, flickering parking rows, and the occasional stray dog sniffing discarded wrappers. That dull routine made it easy for the overnight attendant, Nolan Red, to recognize anything even slightly unusual. And at 2:40 in the morning, something drifted across the screen that made his hand pause above his coffee. The camera over lane 4 showed a long-haul rig pulling in, with its headlights dimmed like the driver barely wanted to be seen. The driver stepped out slowly, moving with the heavy, sluggish gait of someone exhausted from hours behind the wheel. Nolan expected him to stretch or walk toward the mini-mart for a drink. Instead, the man just stood there, facing the pumps without touching anything, as if deciding whether he actually needed fuel. Nolan leaned closer because something felt wrong about the driver's shadow. The overhead light cast it normally at first, but then the shadow elongated behind him in a direction that didn't match the lamp's angle. A shape rose inside the stretched outline, like someone else stood directly behind the driver but remained outside the glow. Nolan tapped the screen twice, thinking the feed lagged, yet the shape didn't disappear. The driver finally turned toward the truck stop entrance and began walking. That was when the shape behind him moved in perfect sync, lingering only a few steps back. It was not the normal flicker of a second shadow. It had definition and clear movement, but no visible body producing it. Nolan's stomach tightened as he watched it tilt forward slightly, then straighten again like it studied the man's pace. He brought up another angle, hoping the second camera would clarify the distortion. The new feed showed the driver's back as he walked toward the door, but the space behind him stayed empty. On the first camera, however, the shape remained. Nolan blinked twice and switched between feeds silently until the difference became undeniable. One angle showed an empty walkway to marking list 217. The other showed something following closely but never closing the gap. He radioed the store clerk, asking her to be aware of the incoming driver because he thought the man looked unsteady. He didn't mention the shadow figure because he didn't want to sound ridiculous, not until he had something concrete. The driver approached the door and slowed before entering, like he sensed something close behind him. He turned his head slightly, eyes narrow, then walked inside while glancing over one shoulder. Inside the building, the clerk greeted him and he nodded stiffly. The cameras inside showed nothing unusual. The man moved slowly down an aisle, then placed a bottled drink on the counter. His hands shook while he paid. Nolan zoomed the interior feed as far as it would allow and saw sweat beading across the man's forehead. The clerk noticed too and asked if he needed medical help, but he insisted he just needed rest. As the driver exited the building, the exterior camera caught the shape again. It followed him exactly as before, staying 3 steady steps behind. Nolan whispered under his breath because the second angle still showed nothing. He switched to the thermal camera, expecting the system to glitch on him. Instead, the thermal feed displayed a faint, cold silhouette trailing behind the driver like a figure carved out of ice. The man radiated normal warmth, while the shape behind him produced a void, colder than the surrounding air. The driver climbed into his rig and closed the door. The shape approached the truck and stopped at the foot of the steps. It did not fade or shift. It remained perfectly still in that cold imprint, while the driver started the engine. When the headlights brightened, the shape appeared to shrink into the shadow of the truck itself, as if hiding from the blast of light. Nolan felt every hair rise on his neck because the shape behaved with intention. He lifted the phone and called state dispatch, reporting a driver in distress accompanied by possible surveillance interference on the cameras. Dispatch took the report seriously since truck-related incidents at night could turn dangerous quickly. They said a patrol unit was already near the interstate and would arrive within minutes. Nolan kept the call line open while watching the feed. The driver shifted into gear and rolled slowly forward. The shape broke away from the truck's shadow and drifted beside the cab at the same pace as the moving vehicle. It kept pace without visible steps, gliding as if pulled along by the truck itself. As the rig exited the lane, the shape turned sharply and moved toward the camera. Nolan reached instinctively for the booth door and locked it, even though he stood hundreds of feet away from the pumps. The shape rose slightly, widening at the top, narrowing near what should have been legs. It reached the base of the pole holding the camera and vanished below the housing. For several seconds, the camera flickered violently. When it stabilized, the entire lane stood empty except for the receding taillights of the truck. The patrol unit arrived moments later and spoke with the clerk while Nolan replayed the footage repeatedly. The officer asked Nolan to save the recording and submit it to state storage because the thermal feed alone required official review. Nolan agreed and printed a report, though he left out his fear. The officer drove after the truck, following the highway northbound to conduct a wellness check. 20 minutes later, the officer radioed in. He located the truck parked on an emergency turnout near a stretch of dark forest. The engine hummed quietly, the hazard lights blinking. The officer approached with caution and called out to the driver. After receiving no response, he opened the cab door and climbed inside. The driver sat upright behind the wheel with both hands on the steering wheel. His eyes were open. His breathing was not. The medical examiner later said the man died 30 to 40 minutes earlier from sudden cardiac arrest. That timeline placed his death minutes after leaving the truck stop. Nothing in the cab showed signs of a struggle. But the officer radioed something strange before the body was removed. He said the interior felt unnaturally cold despite the running engine. Every surface carried a fine layer of frost on the passenger side only. Nolan watched from his booth as emergency vehicles passed the truck stop and disappeared down the road. He replayed the camera feed another dozen times until his shift ended. The shape never appeared after the flicker. The truck stop itself stayed quiet. The following week, the state investigator visited Nolan to review the recordings. They watched the shape move behind the driver again and again. The investigator paused the feed and said the trail where the shape glided showed no disturbance in the dust or stray papers lying near the pumps. The shape moved as though it passed between the surface of the lot and the camera lens. The contrast was too clean to be a shadow or reflection. Nolan asked whether similar reports existed elsewhere. The investigator hesitated, then said one older file mentioned a truck driver who reported being followed by something he could not see. The man felt cold air behind him whenever he left his cab. He died in his rig 3 days after making the report. His camera feed never displayed anything except a faint interference shortly before his death. The investigator closed the laptop and thanked Nolan for his time. Before leaving, he asked whether Nolan personally sensed anything unusual during the incident. Nolan admitted he felt watched even inside the security booth, especially when the shape moved toward the camera. The investigator nodded as if he expected that answer. Today, the truck stop remains open, but Lane 4's camera has been replaced twice due to unexplained malfunctions. Drivers occasionally mention feeling cold drafts behind them when walking toward the store late at night. Nolan never dismisses the complaints. He simply marks the reports and watches the screens a little closer during the graveyard shift. He has never seen the shape again, but each night, as rigs rumble through the lot, he checks lane 4 and wonders whether something still walks a few steps behind the tired men who pass under the lights.